Hello, John. Thank you for coming back to the show here. I just want to remind the audience that we are live streaming on YouTube and we are simulcasting on X Spaces. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat or ask for the mic on X Spaces. We want to interact with the audience, take your questions, so feel free to ask those questions. And also, I have details in the description of this video. You click the links to John's website and you can sign up for the periodical and his readings. We'll go over the details of that throughout this broadcast. But again, thank you, John, for joining the show here. And
Yes.
let's talk about your latest endeavor.
Well, and before we do, I'm going to remind everybody, if you have been a long time with us, to click the like button to show if you've liked what we've done over the years. And if you're new watching us for the first time, if sometime now or at the end of our show you want to click the like button, this really helps us get more people coming to our attention, their attention to us. So thank you very much, whatever you do. Yes, I am just about 20 minutes ago, I finished editing 14 articles of 42,000 words that will be my next Hogue prophecy report. And it is, I personally find some of it, some of the most interesting and refreshing and different things that I've looked at about many different prophetic trends that are all converging so much in this day and age. And what I was working on was a look at how the past Civil War has parallels in the pre-Civil War times of 1859 to 1860, the election, and then the actual war happening in 12th April 1861. To parallels, rhymes at least, if not repeats, of the tale of two catalysts. The catalyst for the past Civil War that many of you may already know about is the Connecticut man named John Brown, who in had been part of the Underground Railway, saving a network that helped with safe houses deep into the South that helped save slaves and bring them to freedom in the North. And he had he was quite an abolitionist. He did eventually move to Springfield, Massachusetts, which was the heartbeat of northern state abolitionism, that is the freeing of slaves. And he was a tanner, a frontiersman, a number of things, but he is most famous for, in his final years, growing a beard about the length of mine, uh, and being a kind of almost biblical-like prophet and a very accurate prophet that he resolved back in 1847 by through just seeing things that were going on in the abolitionist movement, that many of the people there were pacifists and hoped to compel and persuade the southern states to stop enslaving 8 million African Americans, now because they were in America, but they were slaves. And he felt that pacifism is all talk but no do. And he, perhaps rightly, foresaw that this terrible conundrum that the founding fathers of the American Revolution tried to solve the problem, attempt to solve it in creating the Constitution. But I think sometimes it's wise, when a thing cannot be worked out, to put it aside for the sake of the greater nation. Let's build the United States nation and somehow deal with slavery later. And so founding fathers did not wanted to destroy the revolution by trying to tackle this difficult issue of slavery. So it was kind of dealt with over the decades, but eventually it came to a point where one could actually say what John Brown said was right before before it became right. That even on the southern side, Robert E. Lee, and on the northern side, you got Ulysses S. Grant, both in the end reasoned to commanding generals of both sides. Both of them had to reason that we could not solve this problem with any means of civility, and that means the only way to solve it is on the battlefield. Um, Sort of like what is going on in Ukraine, since fascists took over Ukraine and NATO started to use that as the final step of their encroachment upon the Russian people. Russians had been trying to negotiate and doing everything they could to avoid the war that finally they had to step into in 2022 to put an end to the fascists in Ukraine and this persecution of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, which are a very large minority in the eastern part of Ukraine. And that's the civil war that turned into a global conflict that's happening right now in our time. In So what finally happened, and it is best marked in in December of 1847 in Springfield, Massachusetts, at a certain church. John Brown had was an abolitionist and well known by Tupman and leaders black and as well as white in the movement. In fact, was a close associate with Frederick Douglass, the African American who was a leader in getting white America to fight in the North to fight against slavery. And when apparently they spent all night discussing the issue of does pacifism work, or what Brown contended, that sometimes there's a time for peace and there's a time for war, like Ecclesiastes says. And I got to say that a lot of the portrayals of John Brown have him as kind of this madman, wild-eyed, crazy person. But as I studied John Brown, I found him to be a very careful, thoughtful person. And his logic dictated that it may very well be that this can only be solved through a purging of the American people biblically, like a purging through blood on shed on the battlefield to finish this issue of slavery. You can't free the slaves by asking their slave masters, can you please free these slaves? Well, no, they happen to be at the very core of our economy in southern states, so get lost. Um, and it's a very interesting issue that when it finally came to blows, um, before it came to blows, South Carolina's uh, Declaration of Independence and Secession from the South, which became modeled by and copied by all the other southern states, South Carolina being the first to secede, uh, talked about, and I've read it, it talks rightly about how the northern states were abusing the Constitution by allowing property from the South to be squirreled away and stolen and brought into the northern states. The problem with that point of view is the southern property were human beings, African slaves. And so, that crossed a moral line that the South was blinded to see. And it's quite ironic when you consider that it was a very religious time in the United States. There was a lot of people, everybody on both sides going to church, everybody on both sides. You notice, if you ever notice in photographs of the American Civil War, whether they're gray or Union officers and men and generals, they almost look like apostles from the Bible with their long flowing beards like mine. and so forth. So there was a, I often, it's a fact that Southerners and Northerners applied the Bible to reason the right to have slaves or the non-right to have slaves in the North. I mean, you've got to remember there were slaves in the Bible. Even Jesus helped a healed a Roman centurion slave, but he didn't say free a slave. In fact, even though as John Brown pointed out, there are to Frederick Douglass, he said there are statements in the Bible that show that if a man is in bonds, I am bond with him too. Um, and so that was what John Brown thought. And he also basically said, this war, we will have to use violence to end slavery. It won't be any other way. And when the dawn came, and Frederick Douglass later talked about his all-night discussion with John Brown, he said, although I continue to speak for the liberation of 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 Black Americans from slavery, since that talk with John Brown, I became more and more certain that he was right, that it would end in blows in a war, and it did. So what happened is a very interesting. This happens sometimes in history, in prophecy. There was a lapse of time that if you decide, when John Brown had decided that violence, he mused upon it a long time. When he finally crossed the line and converted from pacifism to violence, was around the time he was talking to Frederick Douglass all night in the church, sometime in December 1847. So I mark that as the beginning of a time lapse for John Brown becoming the very biblical prophet of war. And he's probably the one man more than any others who became the catalyst for starting the Civil War. Just one man. And what he did then, after Douglass and him had spoken, uh, several years, 7 years or so later, he and his 5 sons put words of violence into practice in the Kansas Territory, which was not yet a state. There was a proto-Civil War already being waged from 1554 to 1560. I'm sorry, no, I'm so in Nostradamus. I mean, 18. Bear with me because I'm constantly talking in 15th century, 1500, 1600 numbers, and I'm dyslexic. So it's 1855. By 1855, John Brown and his sons had gone to Kansas to join the anti-slaver faction in northern Kansas, waging war with the pro-slavers. And it was a brutal guerrilla war on guerrilla war. And it's where he and his sons gained the notoriety. Of course, the law were all slavers. So, but he started the baptism of blood that this Civil War would eventually need by, um, there was a Lawrence, Kansas, which was pro-abolitionist, had been raided by a bunch of slavers, Kansas slavers, that in the middle of the night set the town on fire while people were in their beds. And what he then did is a few weeks later, he and his sons actually crept into the houses one by one of all the 5 leaders of that arson raid and murdered them. I think he hung them, but so you know, he love him or hate him, he was a man who made his made his decisions and acted upon them. So that's where he becomes a notorious outlaw for a lot of people, especially in the South. But more and more people were especially in New York and in Massachusetts, who were wealthy abolitionists, politicians, and other influencers that began to fund his work surreptitiously. Um, the so he eventually had decided on a plan he was inspired by the slave revolt that happened in Haiti, starting in 1791 and ending, I think, in 1804, where the black slaves of Haiti overthrew the French colonials in a slave war and declared their independence. It's the first time in history that any group of people that's a slave state had become a state. Of course, there was a whole lot of things about Haiti that has not really been improved since that time, I'm sorry to say. But Brown looked at that insurrection and he said, what we need to do is I need to have a band of 1,000 men and freed slaves and other men who wish to come, and we should then raid the armory at Harper's Ferry and empty it of its weapons. And along with the wagons of pikes that we've already collected, we should then start an insurrection in Virginia, because Harper's Ferry is in the slave state of Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C. And so his plan was to go into Harper's Ferry, take the town, take a lot of hostages, cram them in the back of the Harper's Ferry armory, and then make his stand. Um, they started at first to cut the wires, but it wasn't, it ended up not being 1,000 men, but just 21 men doing this. So he went with it anyway. And the they collected hostages, they broke the wires, they cut the wires in Harper's Ferry so nobody could use a telegraph to make an announcement. But he made the mistake, him and his band of men, of blocking the main road where people were coming in their wagons and saying, "Go back, don't come, Harper's Ferry is under our control." So those people turned their wagons around and rode back to the nearby town where there was a telegraph that was working. They telegraphed Washington, D.C., and then a company of U.S. Marines run by a colonel and a second lieutenant of the uh, American Army of the United States, all in blue, came on their way to Harper's Ferry. Um, Now, it gets kind of interesting at this point. When you hear about what happens next, it often sounds like some Hollywood film. And in fact, there is a Hollywood film that portrayed the raid on Harper's Ferry called The Santa Fe Trail that starred Raymond Massey as John Brown and Errol Flynn. Well, I won't tell you who he plays because it's rather intriguing. Um, and this movie was in 1940, I think, and it's MGM or Warner Brothers Studio. Um, this film, so this is what happens. The soldiers get there, the Marines get there, and then the Errol Flynn is told by the colonel to tie a white scarf on his tip of his curved saber and walk up to the door, pound on the door. And then the door was open with John Brown, some of the other men in there. "What do you want?" They said, "I'm here to give you a last chance to surrender. Otherwise, we will raid the armory." And then John Brown said, Raymond Massey, unfortunately, he didn't. So many people play him way too fiery, but he kept all the fire in his eyes and kept his voice steady and slow and said, "This is a good place to die." And so door closed. Um, Errol Flynn gives the signal, jumps out of the way of the front of the place, and all hell breaks loose with a lot of carbines, a hail of bullets and cannon fire hitting this little armory. And so I thought at first until I did the research, I've seen the movie many times, but I wasn't sure. I never actually checked to see if it was just Hollywood putting famous characters who would later be important in Civil War figures. John Brown, we already know, was the catalyst. But it so happens that Errol Flynn's part was actually, he was playing second lieutenant of the Jeb Stuart, who was a Union officer, but he was later to become the most famous cavalry officer of the Civil War, for the Confederacy. And his commander, overseeing the Marines, was none other than the Colonel Robert E. Lee, who later became the most significant commander of the Confederate forces and was commander of its most significant machine of war, the Army of Northern Virginia. So it turns out that John Brown did say those words, that these two were actually there. So two leaders of the Confederate rebellion, with John Brown against them in his rebellion, met at Harper's Ferry. Well, his people were Brown's people were overcome very quickly. I think one Marine was killed. They battered down the door, and in the process coming in, he lost one of his sons killed, another escaped. And he was then hit in the back of the head with a concussion by a Marine and arrested. Now, the governor of Virginia, slave state, had them locked in the offices of the armory, and he spent hours interrogating John Brown, who was laying on the floor bandaged. And it turned out that President Buchanan of the United States, all of the states, was going to try him in federal court as an enemy of the entire United States for treason of causing insurrection. But the governor of Virginia asked for him to let John Brown be tried uh, through the sovereignty of his state, which is under the grounds of trying to cause a slave rebellion. Now, what this did, and Buchanan being the mediocrity of a president that he was, in fact, there were a lot of mediocrities who were president in the 1850s that did a lot to create the climate where civil war had to happen. And so Buchanan said, yeah, why not? And not really realizing how that means that America and its states have not judged John Brown, but only a slave state because of slavery. So that just made the North very angry, because what had happened with John Brown's trial was that the whole North and South was watching. The papers were there. And what they did is, the trial took about a week, and it was over in early November 2nd. And the law was that you don't hang anybody until a month later. So in that period of time, John Brown was constantly getting letters from all over the North, and even being interviewed, where he was publishing why he did what he did. And it's interesting to note that when people asked if they could come and save him, raid the place and save him out of the place where he was being held, um, in Charleston, Frederick County, Virginia, he said, "No, no, I I wish to take my martyrdom here." And so it turned out that uh, he wrote a very neat letter, a few words before he was taken off to be hung on the 2nd of December. And basically, what he said was that I was, now he's more certain than ever that the only recourse to solve this terrible sin of slavery will be in the price of a great ocean of blood that even I, in my vanity, thought I could do with less spilling of blood. Something like that, the essence of it. And so he wrote that down, put onto a wagon to sit on his own coffin as it was rolled out to an open field outside of town, with an entire square of U.S. Army soldiers surrounding the gallows, which made one of the commander of that garrison say, "My God, this is the largest display of military action that the state of Virginia has ever seen." Little did he know that it was dwarfed by what was soon to come in a little more than a year, with vast armies fighting across Virginia, fighting across the states, mostly in the southern states, although, Lee would go into Gettysburg and Pennsylvania, and Kentucky would be hit in the western states. So, um, so basically, the witnesses of John Brown on that cold, clear day said that he walked up without the assistance of a preacher, because he is a preacher, and he walked up and they said he faced his death with calmness and single-pointedness, and they hung him. And when it was announced everybody's ready on that day, across all the Union, people rang bells at noon for John Brown. John Brown was immensely popular, more so than people understand, and especially all the black free states, freed communities across the North were singing Rock of Ages in their churches. It was the biggest mistake that the South did, was to turn John Brown into a martyr, because up to that point, the stoic, slowly burning Union states started to get mad, started to realize everybody, it was one of those moments where the death of one man would make attention on both sides see that it had come finally to this, to war, to civil war, and what a bloody one it was. On the 12th of April, 1861, there were I think the 14th of April, 1865, 4 years and 2 days, uh, if my counting dyslexically is right, is that there was over 600,000 fatalities between the blue and the gray armies. There were 50,000 free slaves who also died, and an untold hundreds of thousands of slaves who died when the slave system broke down during the war. And were no longer, and there were refugees, and they couldn't eat and stuff. So the amount of death exceeded 1 million Americans, black and white, in the Civil War. Everything that John Brown had predicted happened. And so this great, and he always said he did not blame just the South. He said the weight of sin is upon all Americans. And so they will repent through this terrible war and misery and destruction. And they did. But in a strange way, this country was purged of things. It started the difficult century to really bring civil rights to the African Americans. It all came from that one man on 2nd December being hung for his belief that violence must start to this thing, not pacifism, violence. You know, he John Brown read his Ecclesiastes like any good Christian would, the famous statement, there's a time for peace and a time for war. There's a time for love. There's a time for hate. There are times in our existence where war is the only solution, or as the Russians would say, when all diplomacy has failed, war becomes negotiation by any other means. Because they're quoting von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general and great thinker on military science, one of the greatest military scientists that ever lived. And he's quoted chapter and verse by the Russian forces of arms since Tsar's times to the present, to the Soviet times to the present. So from December, we don't know the date, but from December 1847 to the to that hanging, which immediately created an unraveling, followed. It was just, it took one man to kind of make people cross the line and said, here it comes. And, when that happens sometimes, it just unravels. 1860 was an election year. Um, the, the slaving states danced in the street when John Brown was dead, and it also kind of inspired them to think about leaving the Union. And that's when all these discussions happened. Now, what happened was Lincoln was definitely somebody that if he got to be president, the Southern states, they warned we'd leave because of his abolitionist tendencies. Stephen Douglas and him had their famous debate earlier before that he was a Democrat from Illinois. But what happened to the Democratic Party is that it dominated in the southern states. And when the election happened, the Democratic Party broke up into several parties and diluted itself. And of course, the Southerners were not going to vote for Lincoln, but it allowed Lincoln to win a large enough majority to become president of the United States, which therefore created and then very rapidly, all first South Carolina, then I think the Deep South states, uh, they left the Union, and at a certain point, Lincoln, newly minted president, had an audience, Lee was called to the White House to discuss Robert E. Lee being the commander-in-chief of Union forces. He felt like, well, politically speaking, if Lee, so well known, would still preserve the Union as a Southerner, then and it's ironic because just across the river Potomac from Washington, in fact, Lee's plantation he could see Washington just down the hill and across the river from his plantation near Alexandria, Virginia. So he was right on the very edge of the split. And so he was called. And unfortunately, Lincoln had made a speech that rather than stop a whole number of other states, including Virginia, from joining the Confederacy, had caused them to precipitously join. So I think if they had come together, perhaps Lee would have fought the insurrection as the commander of the Union. But when Virginia joined, he got to understand that we don't have this idea, but the 13 states that began, why is it called the United States? It's a bit like, why do they call it the European Union? Not the same, but in this one thing, very much. The states were sovereign states. And to this day, US states have a quality of being independent of the federal government more than you'll find in any other democracy. It's one of the reasons why the Electoral College, which at first, when I started looking at it, I hated it. and I wrote against it. But as I got deeper into understanding our strange country and its unique sovereignty of states, I came full circle and realized by the time of the 2016 election that we need it. It's a way that big populated states don't completely dominate all the other states. In a way, our Congress setup for the House and the Senate had tried a similar thing where the House of Representatives would be by population represented as the lower house, the pleb house, because it's modeled after the Roman Senate, the lower house of plebs and the senators. Now, the senators were the gentry and the wealthy people of Rome, but in a way they try to do the same thing now in the Senate. But but the system was you could have representation by population in the House of Representatives, but all states, no matter how large or small, in the second body, which really allows what the lower body does, can really sees if bills and laws are passed, has to go through the Senate, which gives every state, no matter how large or small, two senators. So that one protects, the lower house protects the individual populations and their influence. The higher house of the Senate uh, defends all states being sovereign and equal. So the so that's kind of that background there. What is interesting to me is what happened in this ellipsing of time. John Brown, when he was basically his journey started in 1847, December, and through his death in 1859 over the Harper's Ferry incident, because there's no seamless break. I mean, his death spawned very quickly after, culminating on 12th April 1861, the American Civil War, the hot American Civil War. And so his destiny defined and evolved uh, is completed by the creation of the Civil War that purged the North and the South of slavery. And it's interesting to note that the period of time that he became the activist of violence and the violence was fulfilled was 13 years, 4 months, and 12 days from 1847 to the beginning of the American Civil War on 12th April 1861 with the bombardment of the Confederates in Charleston Harbor of Fort Sumter. And so keep that thought because now we're going to go way ahead over 160 plus years to another person who is not repeating John Brown's legacy, but he does rhyme. You know, Mark Twain is right. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And one of the things it rhymes doing is a variation on a theme. What I apply in my essay in the second article about this of the 14 is how it's not just rhyming, it's Alice through the looking glass. Anybody who's read Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Alice in the Looking Glass by Peter Carroll, I think he was his name. Well, Carroll was the last name. I don't think I got the first name right, but anyway, the whole thing is little Alice sees that there's something going on the other side of the mirror in her house. And she has this magical way of going through the looking glass. And what then happens is everything's in reverse fashion to what it was before. And there's a certain looking glass phenomenon that happens in our history often. I mean, one of the ways it happens is, give you an example, how the Vietnam War, and many decades later, Operation Iraqi Freedom into Iraq in 2003, the others in 1964, have a lot of parallels. or a looking glass karmic echo. For instance, in 1964, there was an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where PT boats of the North Vietnamese Army of North Vietnam Navy purportedly fired upon U.S. destroyers. It was what caused the Congress to put aside their constitutional obligation to not let a president get into a conflict without declaring war. But instead, they acquiesced to a special thing that allowed Johnson to use this as a police action in Vietnam and start his Operation Rolling Thunder, where he began bombing North Vietnam and he began expanding what had only been advisors in South Vietnam to eventually about 500 to 600,000 U.S. troops in fighting in Vietnam. A few weeks later, Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, had to admit to him that the Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened. Probably what happened was this is my own conjecture because nobody seemed to explain how that didn't happen. But knowing the tropics, since I've been there a lot, maybe it was possible that people that were at a high pitched tension in the U.S. Navy were looking and seeing flashes from distant lightning and firing back at it. It thought maybe if somebody was firing at them. Whatever happened, basically the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a complete flop. It had no fact in it. Now, move to 2003. You have in the previous year, the Senate was convened with the CIA of George W. Bush's presidency, young presidency. He was in the middle of his first term. And they said that we have evidence to prove that Saddam Hussein is creating weapons of mass destruction, that the weapons that were destroyed, there's more. And who knows, he could drop a bomb on Ohio someday. And even Colin Powell, to the detriment of a great man's career, flashed the vial of anthrax and said, this could be dropped in our country from the terrorists. And even it got around, it was absolutely spurious and false that Saddam Hussein was even in cahoots with Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And I remember for the years and the thousands of dead Americans and the crippled sons and daughters that also came home, and seeing lots of footage of families reconciling their losses by saying, well, Saddam Hussein was with Al Qaeda, so we were fighting Al Qaeda. Absolutely false. Saddam Hussein was better at killing Al Qaeda terrorists in his dictatorship than we were. He was a Sunni secularist, pan-Arab Ba'athist, the Arab Renaissance. He had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden, thought that they were all criminals. And he never met him. That was all cooked up by the Vice President, Dick Cheney. So what happens? They go ahead with this war. Kind of interesting that just a few weeks before the war happened, there was an omen. The Columbia Space Shuttle flying over Texas, George W. Bush's home state, broke up in re-entry over Palestine, Texas. And all of the crew was burned and destroyed. And it was quite a spectacular breaking, like a great comet meteor breaking up over Texas as dawn rose. Brilliant white light and fire. And then a few weeks later, the war happened. And the war that killed 7,000 contractors and U.S. troops, 30,000 wounded, 15,000 of which were severely crippled. 1 million Iraqi civilians were killed, and there was this brutal civil war that came out of it. George Bush Jr. Dared Al Qaeda to get into the center of the heartland of the Arab world and fight his men on the streets. They did, and they made broadcast films of. They said, President Bush, we have heard you, and we are here. And that brought Al Qaeda, thanks to Bush, it brought Al Qaeda into the heartland land of the Arab world, causing untold death and violence. Eventually, he got in this quagmire, and it lasted 8 years. And the armies, when Obama was there, had to march out of Iraq in darkness so they wouldn't be bombed by roadside bombs as they left. We lost immense treasury. It was the first big wound, first big step in the decline and fall of the United States hegemon. Now, LBJ, President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was a Texan. Lyndon Baines Johnson had the Gulf of Tonkin as his excuse for starting a war in Vietnam, which became a catastrophe for the United States, a quagmire lasting 8 or 9 years of combat, and was very detrimental, caused riots at home, all kinds of things. And it was all based on a lie. Go ahead. And he's a Democrat, by the way. Go ahead to 2003, and you have a Republican Texan, George W. Bush, not going into a jungle to get the Americans killed, but going into a quicksand, into a desert, and having his own Vietnam, his own getting the Americans into a civil war like North and South Vietnam, now fighting Sunni and Shia Muslims in the streets of Baghdad, in the crossfire. Um, so can you see the parallel? History does not repeat itself. It's rhyming. Two different Texas presidents, two false weapons of mass destruction. In the one case, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, on false pretexts. Wars that cost a lot of American lives and were big steps towards America losing its hegemonic forces now. So, coming back to the Civil War, you have, so we've talked about John Brown, but the catalyst, potential catalyst for a future Civil War was Charlie James Kirk, the founder on the 5th of June 2012, when he was 18 years old, of Turning Point America. He became a leader of Christian nationalist movement uh, and also a great influencer in the MAGA movement, Make America First movement, to the point that during the presidential elections of 2024, he convinced a very disgruntled majority of Democrats who were young and moderate, did not like how the woke people abducted their party. They left the Democratic Party, joined the MAGA voters, and got Trump reelected in a delayed second term. Now, so this is huge changes, and a lot of it was because of Charlie Kirk's debating, his evangelism, and so he was a one man that made a huge change. Notice that um, Brown in this rhyme was an old at the end, wearing the long white beard and looking. He was 59. That's pretty old for those days. An old white-haired man. He's replaced by a young John Brown, who wasn't even 32 before he was assassinated and killed. Both men died through the neck. Brown by the noose, Charlie Kirk shot through the neck. And so what now? what is different with this is that, and I stress again, John Brown, there's no break in the seam of what John Brown did to incite a civil war, hot civil war. It just his death galvanized it, sped it along. With Charlie Kirk, it's a little, it's a little, well, in a good way, his death, as tragic as it is, has opened a possibility that is really dependent on Trump, what he does in the next, between now and the midterm elections on, I think it's 6 November, Tuesday, 2026. Kirk, um, a lot of Americans, including Charlie Kirk, before he was killed, and my articles go into the whole what the hell that's all about, which might even lead to international influence from a certain Middle Eastern country, a certain prime minister, that his whole his loss was being filled by other influencers that also were friends of his that stepped up to keep the MAGA movement going, because the MAGA people and the Democrats that joined it were turning to people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and others to try to get some feeling of why, and try to pressure with love and compassion, because they loved Trump, try to make him remember that they are America first, and he promised to do all these things to change things for the better. No more foreign wars, no more even having to stop in his fantasy that he stopped 4 wars, and then here he is, uh, fighting a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, um, deep involved in the collapse of Syria and the wars that Israel is involved with. He is the enabler, like Biden was before, of the genocide that's going on in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, by Zionists. Uh, he is, and his people are saying, even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a total supporter of Trump, is now saying, what are you doing? You're not following, and you're surrounding yourself with all these neocons. What is going on? What about the things you promised, which he has done none? He has not fulfilled any of those promises. And his response is to be brusque and said, I don't need you people anymore. At one point, he did even say that. He said, I'm here now. This is my last term. I don't need you. We could get into the reasons why he's acting so odd. And I have on this show got into it. He's walking the same road that Biden walked. Two very old presidents are having cognitive issues. One's already through, and now we have this situation coming up. So there's this pause. There's a pause where maybe, see what I also talk about in this is that these articles is that the cold Civil War, in my view, because people are feeling there's a cold Civil War. I even back in 1997 wrote, said on BBC Radio that if the future midterm elections in 1998, if this polarity between Republicans and Democrats becomes deeper and deeper, dividing the nation, that we'll be in a civil war by 2020. What happened in 2020? The shutdown through COVID, which stopped America in its tracks, stopped its economy. Whether it's right or wrong, I can definitely debate at another time. But civil wars are often caused by a plague, by an economic upheaval. And that set the stage. Later in the year, because of the plague, it was decided that every state should have balloted vote by, send it in the mail. And I live in one of the few states that have been doing that before, Washington State. And I can tell you there's a lot of problems with it. And for all these other states to suddenly decide to jump in without having any time or not even consulting the ups and downs of it from people from my state, they just jumped in, and the whole thing was full of a lot of fraud. And it's finally coming out. If you said it, you'd be canceled. You couldn't say it on certain platforms. But there was a whole lot of frauds. There were millions of fake ballots or ballots that were not legal that got passed through and rushed in. They're all still in sacks somewhere in all 50 states. And if it would be very, very good if we had that disputed national election be opened like happened a year after the 2000 Florida recount, which was whoever won the recount in Florida would either see George W. Bush or Al Gore as president. Now, in my long period of being 16-0 and predicting presidents since 1968, one of the ones that caused a lot of controversy was when I said, no, Gore won the election. Bush did not. And they said, oh, it's just that you want Gore. No, I don't want Gore. I don't. That's not how I run. Um, I don't want Bush either. I want a real president, like a Lincoln or a Kennedy or even Nixon. I'd rather have, because despite the Watergate issues, Nixon's did a lot of very good things in the world that he's not given credit for because of his strange character and his shame from the Watergate issue. But so I said, well, all you need to do to prove me wrong is recount those ballots. Now, Gore choked. He could have had his ballots recounted, and he choked and under pressure, which shows he would have been a weak president. He should have stuck to his guns, because guess what? When they counted it, all those ballots properly, he won by 75 votes in the recount a year later. So I demand a recount of 2020, because I I predict, as I did before it happened, when it hadn't happened yet, that there are at least 5 million ballots that are fraudulent, almost all of them voting for Biden. And that my sense, my feeling, which was correct back then psychically, maybe is correct in 2020, is that Trump once again won the Electoral College against Biden winning the popular vote, just like what happened with Hillary Clinton. And he would have then, because of the Electoral College being as it is, as we talked earlier, that the representation of the states versus the counties, he would be president then. And it's kind of sad, because being president 4 years later makes him 4 years closer to the window that his family does sometimes suffer of dementia issues. So it's how, when things are done evil and wrong, picking Mr. Bush got us the Iraq situation and the Great Recession. When it's chosen wrong, the evil doesn't end there. Its karmic consequences follow. An illegitimate president. We've had now two illegitimate presidents in this new century, for 8 years for one and 4 years for the other. And the last one almost got us into a world war with Russia. We're not out of that danger yet. So anyway, so what happened with Charlie Kirk is that he his his process, it started in, let's see, where are we? Yes. Now his trajectory ended up being to his assassination and death. Uh, really ends the comparison. It started with his his rise to being this mover and shaker of American politics, starting with 5th June 2012, when he, at 18, founded TPUSA, Turning Point USA. If there's one man that had more influence in getting Trump voted into office in his second term, it's Charlie Kirk. And his death now has opened up a potential opening window that um, could still see us avoid this cold civil war that we've been in since 2020 from happening uh, sometime after going hot, sometime after the midterms. So keep this in mind. The period I said of John Brown's rise and the ultimate consequence of the Civil War was 13 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Charlie Kirk is out of this picture, and it's us to decide whether this goes into a civil war, because his period was 5 June 2012, starting the TPUSA, that ended on 10th September 2025 through being assassinated. That period of time is 13 years, 3 months, and 5 days. So 14 years, 4 months, and 12 days for Brown. 13 years, 3 months, and 5 days for Kirk. It's kind of an interesting parallel there. Very rare. So what then will happen? Kirk is gone. Will Trump take up actions that would cause, will he continue to follow his cabinet of neocons and ignore all the things he promised his people that he would fulfill, and get more and more lost in forever wars? Will he do that? Well, if he does, what could happen is by November of 2026, when the midterm elections happen, if he continues to alienate, it's very possible that the MAGA people and the Democrats that also voted along with the MAGA people to make him president will, in the midterms, sit on their votes. And if that happens, then a small majority, not anything close to what do they call it? Not anything close to a 16% or more people voting beyond, a proof that the majority spoke, but a minority that wins because the other people didn't vote, which often happens in midterms, but in this coming midterm could really be a record-breaking low turnout for a completely disgusted MAGA and red conservative American base. And so what you then have is you then have, if we go back to Biden's was a big step in 2020. His presidency started to use lawfare, and with the control of the Democratic Party by extreme woke people, just controlled the party, be radicalizing it. And this is where we started to see where they were trying to stop Trump through lawfare, through banana republic moves, through the misuse of the third tier of the United States government, the judicial system. You have the Congress and the executive branch. These are the three tiers, the three checking balances of each other that the founding fathers of our country created in the U.S. Constitution. They started to misuse where, this idea. So what then happened is it really galvanized a lot of people to vote for Trump as well. That is what also made a lot of people leave the Democratic Party. And because Biden was not compos mentis to really even run, and the person that was replacing him kind of in a coup, a White House coup, Kamala Harris, was a rather cackling fool. And her choice for vice president was a piece of a piece of cuckoo. from Minnesota. Um, and I must say, I agree with him on one thing. He said, sometimes I'm a knucklehead. I just disagree. I think you're always a knucklehead. And so that scared people, sane people, people who are trying to find a common ground with their neighbors away. But then what then happens, because it's in Trump's chart, he now that he had the power, he started corrupting the power by taking revenge. Trump, if you go against Trump, he'll get you. And he's taking almost like a mob boss. He's now starting to do exactly what Biden and the Blues were doing. His red government is red Republican is going seeing red and it's starting to use lawfare. And he's behaving like a king. I don't see anything he's done of late that isn't a tyrant's way of doing things now. And I attribute a lot of it to his greatest weakness, which I saw a year before he even ran the first term. He's a wide open channel with an afflicted but very powerful channeling power that makes it very easy for him to be influenced by others. And he is even more radically than before. So if that doesn't change, if he doesn't turn that around between now and the midterm election and start doing what the people who voted him into office wanted him to do, they won't vote for him. And then what's left is a return of even a worse blue meanie backlash than Biden that will create in his final 2 years of his presidency will create a climate of the cold Civil War having turned into a war of lawfare between the blue and the red, not the blue and the gray anymore. That's another rhyme. The blue and the red waging a political lawfare war and leaving the third tier of government out of the loop because no one is following the Constitution. This would then create, if the 119th Congress becomes both Democrat houses against Trump, that war will ensue in early 2027 up to and possibly before that Congress is replaced and the president retires in 20th January 2029. Somewhere in that area, we will see this cold civil war since 2020 become a hot civil war and a really nasty one. A balkanization is what I called it. I mean, in the thing I predicted back in 1997, I wrote this comment. If the US Congress continues to sustain and intensify a partisan deadlock between Republican and Democrat legislators into the early decades of the 21st century, there will be a balkanization of America, either caused by a bloody civil war or revolution beginning by 2020. I said that on BBC Radio in 1997. Um, Now, I have a book called Beyond Alt Left, Beyond Alt Right, Alt Right, Alt Left, a community of Americans, which I wrote in 2017, um, where are we here? Here we go. Where I mentioned not only my own prediction, but also a number of American seers from the latter half of the 19th century who, after the Civil War, very clearly and succinctly and in detail predicted that if there was a Second World War, it would be a balkanization of America. Uh, One of the founding fathers of the Mormonism, Orson Pratt, I'm just going to give an example of one of the prophets talking about that. Um, and I presented him in this way. In the 1870s, Orson Pratt, one of the early fathers of Mormonism, described the coming balkanization of America would be a war pitting, and I quote, neighborhood against neighborhood, city against city, town against town, state against state, and they will go forth destroying and being destroyed. Manufacturing will almost cease. Great cities will be left desolate. That's a potential future that is looming before us and the American people. So I say to you, if you don't want it to happen, redouble lovingly to the president, but make him hear you. He channels whoever is loudest. Make him come back to channel what he promised you, why you voted for him, Democrats and Republicans. Or else you are facing a far worse civil war than the one that we endured in the 1860s, that John Brown said was only could be ended, the slavery, through blood. What about your slavery? What about your slavery to literacy, to your Constitution? How many of you have read your Constitution, if you are Americans? Do you not think it's the very responsibility of a citizen of this country that you read this 4,000 plus word document and know your rights and know, therefore, how they are not being followed? There's been a conspiracy in this country since the 1980s where powers that be, which have always been against our Bill of Rights, even in the days of George Washington as the first president, they have been against our Bill of Rights. You know, the attack on the First Amendment began maybe months after the Constitution was signed, and it goes on. A lot of people who are power freaks do not like the First Amendment, freedom of speech and religion, freedom of assembly, uh, which requires a free press to keep the citizens informed. They're against the Second Amendment, which I think is quite radical in any constitution that's been made, because it basically gave the right, it can be interpreted that it gave the right for the people to rise up in arms to overthrow a government that is not fulfilling this constitution. So the right to bear arms and form militias, uh, you can debate what arms they are because that is not detailed, but it gives the rights of states to defend their sovereignty. The South thought they had a right to do that because their property was being stolen. But since the property was human beings and it was rather immoral property, it ended up to blows. If this civil war happens, it's because the American people have succumbed to a long, slow process of pulling civics classes out of all of your schools. Because what they learn from the post-war period into the 60s and 70s is that people, high school kids, couldn't get a diploma unless they had civics class. And and that means kids who were African Americans in the 50s, they knew their civil rights because they had civics classes. That is why Martin Luther King was able to advance, because he was not alone. He had a whole literate population of African Americans who knew their rights. That is why the complete abuse of Congress not declaring war in Vietnam, making it some kind of quasi something, but not what the Constitution says. Only the Congress can vote whether we go to war or not the president. That's the checks and balances. The Congress, so the people that burnt their draft cards when I was growing up during the Vietnam years, they were actually legally right to do that because the draft board and its government was committing an illegal act, sending them to war. And back then, it was through a draft. So you didn't choose to volunteer to the armed forces. Everybody had to serve in the draft. And if you were drafted, you had two choices. You could be a volunteer and join the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force. But you're going in. And it was also spread across all classes. So whenever we went to war in the 60s and 50s and stuff, everybody's family, rich and poor, could lose children in such a war. So people were a lot more, I mean, in a way, one of the worst things that happened in the United States was when we went all volunteer army. Because then just a small group of America was fighting and dying for our mostly colonial wars. Um, I don't want to draft. We almost moved my brother to Canada, my older brother, because of the draft. I certainly didn't want to be drafted. Um, but in the reality is there was something better about that because everybody had a stake. So everybody had an opinion. And some silly president could not just decide to tell his Secretary of State to play around with a fake vial of anthrax to get 7,000 men and women murdered in Iraq and many more wounded. I think it would have been the same numbers of Vietnam if it hadn't been for our advances in medical triage that saved most of the wounded in the Iraq War. I think you could have easily added another 15,000 dead to the 7,000 because that golden hour was just something that was not going to happen in Vietnam and other places. So, so we have read your Constitution. Read your Constitution. If you're an American citizen, I would say you are obligated to read it. Otherwise, you're really not an American citizen. You don't have to, you're free. You're even free to be a fool. But these people that started taking our civics classes away since the 1980s have made the American people stupid. They don't know their rights. And if you are a people who don't know your rights, what's the next step? The next step is a government that shows signs of even when the Supreme Court tells you you can't do something, they do it anyway. And what's the Supreme Court in their robes going to do? Come out and fight you? That is what's coming next. A complete disrespect to the Constitution, because frankly, this batch of fools that are running the country right now, including the president, don't seem to even know their Constitution. The Congress today, Democrat and Republican, except for a handful of people like Massey, like Rand Paul, they remind me, harken back to the times of better days when we really had representatives in the Congress and the Senate. These people are all alone in a sea of sheeple that don't even know the Congress. Most of them are paid for by a foreign country to do their bidding. America first, it's Zionism first now. And Zionism is a form of fascism that has overtaken and possessed Israel. I'm sorry to say. Let us not let it overtake and possess our country. So this I'm always a person having to play Jeremiah with you, just kind of repent, I promise not to run around naked down the streets of Jerusalem. It wouldn't be a pretty sight. So my beard's not long enough to cover myself like Lady Godiva. But he was so upset that he had to literally to get people's attention. Which is very faux pas, very shocking to do in the ancient Hebrew society. But he ran down naked throughout the streets of Jerusalem so that he'd get attention. And he's saying, "Repent." And what happened? The Babylonians conquered the two Hebrew nations. The first temple was burned down, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Hebrews were in captivity in Babylon. And ironically, they were saved by the Persians, the very same people that modern day Zion wants to destroy. What an interesting rhyme that is in history, past and future. It was Cyrus the Great that helped Israel rebuild the temple, second temple, and rebuild their nation so that they could be good allies to the Persians. You know, and that's it. I'm
We
done.
do we do have a couple
Good.
questions. So 10 tigers is the one that typed the question.
10 tigers.
All right. I'm gonna read it, it's like a two-part question.
Okay.
So could balkanization work? All Dems move to California or New York, and Republicans move out of those states. In some ways, separation sounds like less violent way out. So the main point here is that, and you kind of see it in New York, there are people that are starting to plan to move out,
Yeah.
right? So there is this balkanization that's taking place, like you
Yeah.
mentioned, but if the Republicans, let's say, move out to the rural area or even to suburbia, and the Democrats move to urban environments, it's probably, there is a case to be made that maybe that distance will at least lessen the war, lessen the new Civil War or the Civil War 2.0.
Yeah, I actually in my other articles in this, I go into the whole demographics of the Civil War and how it's changed in our time. I use maps. It's really not a war of the states if it comes in the future. It's a war of the counties.
Mm.
The counties that are in metropolitan blue areas and have these, and I have the map where you show a absolute sea of red that is the United States with little blue
Mm.
island archipelagos. I
Mm.
mean, even California, the bluest of the blue states, if you look at it by county, all the millions and millions of the majority are hugging onto the coastline, with Inyokern being one of the only rural areas, and maybe the blue island in Central Valley called Sacramento, metropolitan Sacramento.
Mm.
But otherwise, the whole state is red.
Right.
And
A
when
lot of
I
people
was
don't realize that out of the more than 3,500 counties that are in the United States, 3,000 of them are Republican.
yes,
Only 500 roughly
yeah.
are Democrat.
So what 10 Tigers is proposing is a America where we coexist with the two polarities. Um, if you ever wanted to see my master Osho get his buttons pushed, he said, "I hate coexistence. I hate it. It's enmity. In fact, it was it's one of the ugliest ways to live. It's fake, it's phony, and it eventually does not work. Let's say we have a country, and it is already balkanizing, actually. Let's say we have a country where it is true that most of the industries and most of the urban America is blue, but there are some states like Texas, of course, that not only do they have blue, I call it the blue islands of El Paso, of um, Austin and San Antonio, and Houston, uh, with a sea of red that also has Dallas, Fort Worth, and some other major metropolitan areas that are also urban. So in a way, Texas would be the kind of most powerful state in the ruralist America, and the bluest America would be urban. But here's the thing. You can't coexist in such a thing like that with all the metropolitan areas being like castles in a sea of red. Um, yes, you might stop doing business with the rural people and not giving your products to them that you make in the cities, and they can cut off your food. Moreover, if the blue want to do that, you're not as well armed as they are. There are 400 million guns in this country owned by civilians, and 90% of them are owned by rural America who believe in forming militias and the Second Amendment, who kind of understand that sometimes you have to fight for your republic. I don't see that happening so much in the blue places. And I'm not blue or red. I'm a free wing. My politics, I belong to the free wing community. I am not going to make a mistake of grabbing onto one wing and flying with one wing this way or flying with one wing that way, because you will crash. I mean, what we need is a community of Americans. We need to reconcile our differences and tolerate each other. That's the way out of this. The way of pretending to live with each other but really hating each other, that will end in blows, 10 tigers, I assure you.
Let me let's
Let's
let's do the second question
yeah,
here.
thank you, 10 tigers. Great questions.
Well, he does have a rebuttal here, but let me do the second question.
Let's do the
What's
second
your
question and we'll do the rebuttal.
yeah? What's your take on Mamdani and this kind of push for Marxism, or being a a democratic socialist? And I don't know. I see it almost as like a Trojan horse.
Yeah, I have a problem with that too. You know, what was it? What was the way that it happened in the conversion of people and the expansion of the Muslim
Right.
religion, that after Muhammad, it expanded all across the Arab world, the Persian world, North Africa, up into Spain. And I mean, in a way, that it was while we were in mud huts in the Dark Ages, it because of the common tongue and a lot of commonality that gave to this vast area, it was a golden age. It was the Arab Renaissance, the Ba'ath, the Ba'ath. It's what the Ba'ath is like. Saddam Hussein and Hafiz Assad of Syria were trying to actually unite with Nasser and others to create the Ba'ath, the Renaissance in Arabic. But also, there were instances where people came and then once they had power, declared a caliphate in a country that had somebody come in. So that's the kind of Trojan horse I wonder about, being that uh, it's interesting that you can say that there are a lot of things in Islam that is about social justice and socialism, uh, but with a theistic side to it. I mean, I've lived in a lot of places in India and stuff amongst Muslims and Hindus and other people. So, it's like the problem I have with Charlie Kirk listing all, I think we did talk about this last time, where he listed all things that he wanted in his community, and they were basically things anybody would want. No lawlessness. Your kids go to school, they learn, they're not suppressed, and you can worship the religion you wish to worship. And then suddenly he went off the deep end. He was a young man. He reminds me in his debating a lot of myself when I was 31, and he he said, and then I don't want to hear any muezzin, anybody reciting the five prayers echoing in my neighborhood. And I'm saying, well, and I would have applied, and actually, in a lot of these articles, I look at all the famous moments in video where somebody got dismantled by Charlie Kirk, and I fictionally put myself as the next person to answer what he said. The fact that, a lot of people thought that he was Socratic in his debate skills. No, he wasn't. He was sophist. He was the very reason why Socrates would be very loving and tolerant and just ask questions, and through gentle but inquiry, uh, show the person where perhaps they're they're following false premises. And it still got him poisoned by Athens, by the sophists who basically, I mean, for instance, there's one major problem. How can you be um, a sophist uh, who looks at skeptical inquiry? And that means skepticos means not cynical inquiry, where you're open, like to doubt in its true meaning is to hover between two possibilities. You're right or you're wrong, and then go deep into it. It's not to come in where, well, I think that's wrong or I think that's right and I'll defend it. No, that's bias. You're already biased. But the problem that I would have started off with, Charlie, would be that what is belief? Faith is belief. Faith is not knowing. Faith is trusting that this is true. And then what will happen is, if Kirk made the mistake a lot of people I've debated on this have made, he says, well, I know Christ is risen. I know. I said, no, you don't. You do not conflate faith with knowing, because if you understand the English language, they do not meet. Faith is a qualified ignorance. Knowing is when you know it is true or not from your own experience. You know, so I have a whole lot of things like that where I kind of put myself into, excuse me, let's continue this debate after you destroyed this person. And it's not her fault or his fault. It's just it's a testimony to how them and their parents have wasted their money on this Utah university, who doesn't know how to teach critical thinking, probably because they don't want to teach them critical thinking. Because then they're not such malleable cogs in the descent of this country into fascism. So, what was his question? What was Ten Tiger's question again? My
Oh,
brain again.
the rebuttal, or the
No,
Mon.
no, the second one,
All
then the
right,
rebuttal.
all right. The Mandami question is,
Oh, Mamdani, I remember now. I
what's your take
I
on
remember.
what's going on in New York, and do you think that
I have been following it. You're in the midst of it.
right, right,
Well, I think he's going to win,
yeah,
and and then we'll see if he isn't a socialist, or a Muslim fundamentalist in socialist clothing. And it isn't a Trojan thing. It's possible. It's
yeah.
possible.
There's two layers to this. There's the Marxism layer, and then there is the extreme Muslim layer, and it's almost like it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, but who's the wolf?
Yeah,
Is
and
the
and
wolf?
and
Is the
frankly,
wolf?
there's a lot of you can see a similar thing happening in Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is, if somebody's elected as a Christian nationalist, and frankly, Charlie Kirk had a very good chance. I write about it, that people were considering him to be the next JFK and running, maybe in the next election or after that, and becoming, JFK would be replaced by CJK, Charles James Kirk. And but Kennedy made a big point. It was a big snafu. A lot of people were upset about having a Catholic become president of the United States. It was as considered a Trojan horse, as big a Trojan horse as what's happening with the New York mayoral um, election. Now, Kennedy made it very public and clear that he understood the situation. And there's a speech that's out there. If you just Google or YouTube Kennedy's Catholic speech, you will see how Kennedy went into I think it was a bunch of Protestant ministers and stuff, and he went right in the devil's den, into the den of Protestantism that run the country. And he made it very clear that according to the Constitution, there's a separation of church and state. If I were to debate this man who may be mayor of New York, I think everybody should be asking him hard and clear, are you going to separate your faith from your job?
Exactly.
You have the right to worship your faith. That's in the First Amendment. But you are now going to have to understand that this country runs on the government not taking sides in religion.
Here's the problem, John. In terms of, if you look at the lens of Sharia, it is in many ways antithetical to the Constitution.
Mm.
All right. Now, Marxism, all right, is antithetical to capitalism. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So if our Constitution is laid on the foundation of the Enlightenment in John Locke,
Yes.
about life, liberty, and in his case, in John Locke's case, he mentions property.
Yeah.
Now, Mamdani is running on a platform where he's talking about taking control of property. He's running on a platform that's taking control of the means of production. This is coming
No,
right
he's
into his mouth. So
well,
this is antithetical to the Enlightenment and
yeah,
literally the foundation of our Constitution.
absolutely. I would never vote for him.
But
I would never
here's
vote for
here's
that
the
man.
sad thing is that one of the CNN reporters, I don't remember his name. He's the guy that's always doing the magic wall thing for the
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
and
Wall man, magic wall man.
right, you know who I'm talking about. So
Yeah.
he went through the five boroughs, and he was asking individuals relatively randomly who they were going to vote for. All right, and I'll tell you, when he was interviewing in Manhattan, some young individuals. One was in their 20s, the other one was in their late 30s or maybe 40, 41, and they were going to vote for Mamdani.
Yeah.
But when they asked why, it was like, well, he's willing to try new things. So the problem that's happening with the younger generation, they don't understand history. They weren't even born when the Berlin Wall fell. They have no idea that the great experiment of capitalism on the west side, of Europe after World War II, during the Cold War, and Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
the great experiment has already been played out. And capitalism won and communism didn't.
Yep.
So these people want to rehash something that's already been proven out because they didn't learn the critical thinking skills
Yeah.
in college.
Well, and that's if anything is going to break up this country until it's just a bunch of little countries on their own, it is how we have systematically made the United States generation after generation of young people stupid. Because what'll happen is you'll get somebody like this. He will try to socialize New York City. It won't work. And then, just like the communists tried to take over Germany, and then there was this guy, I used to see it all the time in high school. There was this really powerful law and order speech. And this person would read the speech to all the people who were then kind of, well, let's just let everybody hang it out there. And the speech sounded like it could have been written by Johnson or Lyndon Baines Johnson or Nixon or somebody. I said, well, who wrote that speech? Adolf Hitler. You know what happens when that stuff doesn't work? Fascism. Because people get sick and tired of people who are mucking things up and the chaos. When things go into chaos, people want order.
Well,
And I said this 20 years ago. I said this.
this is total. This goes right with the Republic by Plato. where they're
Yeah.
talking about how the plebs and democracy, they push forward the mass of the lower class is pushing for policies that they don't even realize will destroy their society, and then all of a sudden a tyrant comes in.
Yeah. That's what happened to the Greek experiment of democracy. Pericles,
Yeah.
became the dictator because, frankly, he, you know, if you don't have order, if you don't have some kind of civil scene, you force it. You have to. You know, I'm not against emergency rule, but I'm against emergency rule being anything more but just temporary during the emergency and not ongoing. The Romans had, which our government is modeled after, not the Athenians. That only lasted 40 years. Rome lasted thousands of years. And a lot of it, unfortunately, was imperial and all that. But the Roman Republic actually lasted longer before it became an empire. It actually outdates any democracies by hundreds and hundreds of years. And they had, when there was an emergency situation where democracy cannot work, where all the chiefs want to run the show, you have to pick one chief amongst you. And you have to pick, hopefully, somebody who, when given ultimate power for a temporary period of time to clean things up, which includes power of law of life and death, you have a temporary dictator, triumvir, who runs the show. And you can only just hope that you've picked the wisest among you who will not be stirred by power to hold on to the fascists. That's the twigs in the hatchet. That is the symbol they carried of Roman state. Um, that's where we get the word fascist from. And the fascist is given to Cincinnatus during a early period of, I think, around 700 or 600 BC, when Rome was really young, and it only Latium and the city itself was Rome, just a little neighborhood around there, and they were being beset by an Italian tribal army, which destroyed their army. And so the Senate couldn't come to a quorum, they couldn't come to a result, so they went to the nuclear option. They said, all right, then we have to pick one among us who, for a period of 6 months, will have ultimate power over us, and we must obey whatever he does to end this threat of the Italians tribes coming in and destroying us. We have to form an army now, and we can't have any people arguing, oh, we gotta do it this way. No, if you keep arguing, you're hung. It's like we gotta pick a person who can do this, somebody who's been a general, somebody who is part of our brothers in the Senate, who understands our balance of res publica, of a nation of laws, and don't go against the laws, but put them at abeyance until we kill this threat. Well, they picked Cincinnatus, handed over the fascists to him, and in 2 months, he trained an army. Because this is the thing, when you have totalitarianism, because it has its good sides, totalitarianism gets things done fast when you need to. If democracy is and you got an enemy coming in, you need to drop the democracy for a while and appoint a dictator who has ultimate power over you. But the point is that he fixes the problem. So I'm for anything in the moment that is when it's necessary to use. I can be a totalitarian when it's necessary. I can be a democrat of democracy when it's necessary. Um, I used to say back in the mid 90s, and maybe some of you are as old as me now and hearing me now again, because I remember when you where these people were, oh, we're all for democracy and we would never do those kind of things. And I said, you wait until the 2020s. You wait. When the situation is such, I predict that you and many of you who can imagine that you would support totalitarianism, you'll be the first. You'll be the first to seek fascist law and order. And so I unfortunately, I think This is a Democratic guy that's coming in there. The people who try to say that they're not as fascist as the Republicans, but look what's happening.
Well, this
So
kind of does.
anyway, Cincinnati. So just to finish the Cincinnati thing, Cincinnati had to um, he in 2 months won the war and everything. The emergency was over. So the Senate convened, and he was standing there with the fascists before the Senate and holding it, cradling it in his arms. And they said, well, Cincinnatus, Senator Cincinnatus, legally you can remain for 4 months, our tyrant, our dictator. What do you say? And he stepped up and handed the fascist back to the chief of the Senate and said, the emergency's over. I no longer need to be a dictator. Let us restore the republic and let me go back to my plow and making my wine. And they picked him again in another revolt, an army revolt. A second time, he got the same power and he gave it back. If fascism must be used, in totalitarianism must be used, pray that we have such men and women that will use it totally until it's done and restore democracy. That's because we are in the times that I've been seeing since 1990, which will have these kind of issues. In fact, we're entering the rest of the century that is going to have these kind of issues with all the challenges that are ahead of us, least of which is well, least of which we think is climate change. It is coming. And it is, I know a lot of people groaning right now, but mark my words, my argument for all of you who are groaning right now is the next 20 years of your life. You'll know then that it's come. It's a creeping disaster. And human beings are marvelous in dealing with big disasters right in front of them. They, like a war, and they all get together and they solve it. But this thing is creeping on us like cancer. And when it's finally, all of its tumors are out, you will have to make changes and deal with and tolerate things and have emergency rules from here to there like you've never seen before for the very survival of our species.
Do you think that the creeping that you're talking about is a known, or do you think it's more of an unknown?
You said the creeping, the
The
creeping, right? That's
creepiness of this event. Do you think it's a known, or an unknown?
it's only the only difference is people that have their head up their bum. People who put their head in the sand. They are trying, and it's unconscious, but if they had a little more awareness, if they practice a self-observant life, they would see the motivation there. The known, and the unknown. The unknown is the denial of the known that's coming. I know from my own life of being a meditator, watching myself, it is denial. It is the fear of having to change people, and it's all unconscious. If when you start to look inside and see how many unconscious roots there are to your habits, that changes you. That's why I preach so often that the science of self-observation is very much important for human beings to learn, is what I teach, because because we're entering a time where we have AI to deal with. I mean, what's the known and the unknown about AI? That AI, if you do not remain the master and AI your slave, if you dream of making like God, in your view, a creation in your own image. Remember what happened to Dr. Frankenstein with the Frankenstein monster. It killed him. AI is one of the biggest knowns and unknowns. Most people are not wanting to know where this is going. And I'm here to remind you that your unknowns are just you looking the other way, hoping, whistling in your cemetery that it's not going to pounce upon you. So, what's his rebuttal?
Okay, well, he's typed a lot.
Oh,
He has
good.
typed a lot. So the last thing that he typed in, don't you think that if George Washington saw us as we are today, he would have said, "Yep, I'll be king"?
10
I,
tigers, that's a great question.
well,
Um,
yeah, go ahead.
and I also love that you put a little humor into it, because humor is very important, even for very scary things. Because if you can't laugh at doomsday, what can you laugh at? So, yeah, well, I think the answer to that is what this little story, that after all the years of struggle to create the Constitution, and when they created it in Philadelphia, a weary Washington was crossing the dirt street in downtown Philadelphia from the hall where it all happened, the fights and struggles to create it. And a lady, just a everyday citizen, asked him, a stranger, said, "Well, do we have a country?" And he said, "We have given you a republic, and hopefully you can sustain it." I think Washington uh, dealt with this problem a lot. There was some point towards the end of the revolution where Philadelphia was not giving funds to it was so bad for logistics that the army of the Continental Army was ready to actually rebel, march on Philadelphia and take over the government. It was that bad. And so all of his officers were gathering, and because he wanted to talk to them, and they were ready to convince him to be that king that 10 Tiger is talking about. And what happened is they were all assembled there, that their tension was high, and Washington kind of knew what they wanted to do. And he got up to the podium to speak to them. And they watched him fumble for his glasses, and watched him, like, his eyes. He puts on the glasses, and I've made a lot of sacrifices for freedom in this war. I've I've aged. I'd sacrifice everything for this republic to come. And they kind of felt ashamed, and they realized, no, we just tuck our heads down and keep going. Democracy is messy. It's supposed to be messy. Uh, Dictatorships are clean. The trains run on time. The death camps get their quotas of gas chamber people. It's very efficient. The fact that Germany could fight the whole world with only 80 million people fighting 2.5 billion people, they lasted all that time because fascism is efficient. Even when Hitler was losing it and forcing them to fight for every acre, especially in the Eastern Front, I mean, they did it. But they eventually lost totally. So, um, at least that's my view on Washington.
Uh,
What's 10 Tigers
all
on?
right, I want to read something he typed in about Mamdani,
Oh, good.
just right after you mentioned about him. So if the people went Mamdani and it's a fair election, then they should get what makes them happy. But don't include me in the mess. Know that you can't take. I'd like this phrase that he wrote. Know that you can't take the eggs out of the cake after it's baked.
Very well put. 10
I
Tigers.
think yeah, being a New Yorker, I'll tell you what, there is a concern that he's going to win. There's a high probability that he will win. The election is on Tuesday. There are many people that don't want to vote for Cuomo, but the only way to prevent Mamdani from getting in is to vote for Cuomo. So
Yeah.
I think it's a big question
What
on
a
what
Hobson's
turnout.
choice. What a Hobson's choice, because Cuomo sucks.
Yeah.
But you might have to go for the suck
Right.
rather than this kind of clearly not being straight up with people. And he is, and also there's a lot of really dumb, well-meaning young people who are, if they haven't learned history's difficulties with socialism and Stalinism, you're about to get an objective lesson, and you
My
may
con- my
survive
my
it.
concern is that New York may be the bellwether of this democratic socialism that's starting to spread throughout the country.
And that will deepen the potential of a hot civil war
Yeah.
because the red America will not stand for that, with all its many faults. The red Americans are more literate in their constitutional rights than the people who would want to make this country a blue, meanie, purple hair socialist state. And it will fail. And again, you will be denied your food to feed it, you
All
know,
right.
and you're
Here's
not armed.
here,
So, and you're probably not going to be armed. So it's a whole lot of bravado for an unarmed bunch of people who want to create a Stalinist state.
okay. We have a new.
Stalin had guns.
That's true. Here's another question for you. By
Okay.
core, can you teach critical thinking to stupid people? Now, this is probably a deep question.
No, it's a very deep question. It's actually it's something that I have in what I would stand in fictionally and stand in and answer the other person who couldn't answer it. Like there was this one time a class, there's many of them where this guy, he's an undergrad, but he can hardly express himself and he's seething with anger and it's making him inarticulate and he's just dumping on Charlie. And Charlie said, look, let's make this a conversation, okay? Because the dumping, it's not going to go anywhere with you and me that way, so let's have a conversation. And so I said, well, okay. And all he did was just dump some more. And but what he did, he just let him do it. Charlie's waiting. And he says, I hate you. I think you are. And I would have said to the guy, I said, you know what? You are angry. And you need to express it. You need to get it out so that it can turn into compassion. Because anger, if you accept it, compassion with it, let it come out, but never in public. Dump your demons out in your private space, clean your energy. And then, I mean, Osho used to say, the problem with sannyasins, the disciples, he says, they just misunderstand me. They say, they just immediately get triggered and then they yell at the other person and then they say, well, I'm getting my stuff out. I said, what, you expecting, Osho said, do you expect that your friend is going to act like a Buddha and take all this abuse and not abuse back? So, so he was always about, you have to express your anger and if more people did privately or through meditations, it would clear it out. And then you can think more straight because your energy is not lost in the poison of anger. So it's absolutely right that you're angry, that you really so angry you can't even talk to Charlie Kirk coherently. So it's because this is not the time to talk. This is for you to take a pillow and put Charlie Kirk's name on a piece of paper on it. And then for 20 minutes, you take another pillow as you're squatting on your knees or something, and you start going boom, boom, boom. This is one of Osho's anger meditation. And so you're beating, and Osho say, you'll feel silly, because you'll even feel really ridiculous because nothing's coming up. You just keep acting, it will come. I speak from experience. You just keep going, and suddenly it's like, and it clears you. It clears you. And then you can think better. So anger is okay. Just don't dump on people because then you're going to trigger their anger and it'll lead to blows. But if you have an issue with someone, And this happened in the commune a lot. Osho used to say, do what they have to say if they're overseeing you. Go deal with your anger later. And when you're calm and cool after a few days, when you can talk about the situation without rage and emotion, then talk about it to the person. So this is something everybody needs to do, from the leaders down to the led. And so what was it? What was the other part of the question again?
No, it's just, can you teach critical thinking to stupid people?
Yes. Well, no, you can't. But you can teach. You can definitely teach Charlie Kirk, if he unfortunately was not killed. You can teach him something I wanted to teach him after that guy, because what he said is, "Oh, what?" Suddenly Charlie Kirk interrupted and said, "What have I said that's been racist?" And of course, he had no answer. So he felt even more stupid and more angry. And basically, I would have come up. Uh, And, I would have said, well, Charlie, you've just made a new enemy, that kid. You make a lot of friends, but you make as many enemies. And you kind of remind me of what my favorite quote of Einstein about human nature. He said, the difference between mediocrity and genius is genius knows its limits. So here I see you talking to mediocrities, fools, people who can't communicate. And you're kind of, hey, that's easy. That's not a challenge. You going after mediocrities and putting them down is basically you being a fifth grader going after kindergartens. It's not really, and so I'm wondering, Charlie, if you're a person of um, you see yourself as a person of genius, because you are. What you're doing is a lot of things that you've started a whole movement. There's something there. But what's the limits of your genius when you're constantly using it to easily dismantle people who predictably can't be in your league of communication or stuff? And what is the limit of your genius when one day that kid comes back, and he doesn't come back with his words, he comes back with a gun? What do you think happens when you keep poking those people who have no limits to their mediocrity? What kind of genius are you if you're destroyed in that? So that's one of the things I would have, if I had a chance, and I have in of a lot of these issues with which
Well,
I.
I think when it comes to religious movements, they usually target people that are young, not older,
Yeah.
because they're more malleable, right?
Well, there's
They have
also,
more time, plus they have more time on this earth.
well, and then the other
They're new
thing.
indoctrination.
Well, unfortunately, there's another side to that. What happened to Socrates was because young people are attracted to gurus and teachers, real ones. Young people came to Buddha, young people came to Christ, young people came to Moses, and so the young are fresh and open. That's that side, rather than malleable and manipulated. That's the other side. But uh, the Socratic, because the sophists couldn't argue with Socrates because he very kindly but kind of point out, question and answer, between the partner and the interlocutor, are going, and because they were big egos, because sophism is where, unfortunately, Charlie was more a sophist than a Socrates. His sophistry it would be, I am, I'm trying to convince you that my idea is right. I'm not here to have a dialogue to see if the idea is right or wrong. I know that I'm right. And then I will use the force of my will to propagate using philosophical techniques to convince you. Basically, the sophist is a propagandist, is not somebody seeking the truth. You can't be a faith-based person and act like you know. I'd be happy to debate any faith-based person on that matter, because it's just you cannot make belief a qualified ignorance suddenly knowing. You can only know something from experience or know that you do not know. And the difference between the sophists, where it was Socrates famously would say in the opening of any debate, I know one thing, that I know nothing.
Well, just
A
take it.
sophist would never say that.
Yeah, but just take it from this perspective. If theoretically someone or a group of people knew everything, there would be no faith. There would be no
Well,
faith because everything would be known.
well,
The whole
yes.
idea of faith is realizing there is the potentiality of this unknown thing, whatever it is, and having some sort of belief system that if certain things are followed, that you get to somewhere. I'm trying to say this in a generic way,
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
for discussion. But the
Yeah.
thing is that if theoretically all is known, then there is no need for faith. The whole point of faith is dealing with the unknown.
Well, is reconciling the unknown with a rationalization. I mean, here's the problem. Um, I like to use the metaphor of waves on the surface of the ocean are constantly comparing, they're believing, they're following certain religions, they're against certain religions, they're splashing about. But at no point do any of the waves understand that the source, which they might call God, which they might call the source that is the source of knowing that creates all these things, is not the surface source of the shape of waves who are trapped in believing. That believing is the process is to remember the source in you, the source which is the ocean that you can't see in a world of splashing waves because it's all the surface of it. And the point is that when you look in as a wave and realize you are not just a shape, but you are the ocean, then immediately you're experiencing a unanimity with all illusory forms of ocean that are not inwardly seeing that the shape is transitory, the wave rises and falls, but the ocean is eternal. And so it is the known is that. The belief is one of the ways in the steps of the search from the alone to the alone to the alone, as Plotinus would say, is to the there will be faith. It's part of the process, but it's not the end. And the biggest problem is that everything that is ego based, that we come in with this oneness of oceanicness, and this is it's often considered, you can see it and recognize it from innocence. It's innocence, and the society, well-meaning but unconscious to that innocence because they've lost it. Even the parents have lost it for the most part. They love you, but they want to make sure that you can adapt into this world that is identified with the shape of waves. Because you're not going to make it in this world. You won't. And so what then happens is, even in the search for truth, everybody tries to seek the Buddha or seek God. And because the ego, the temporary body mind shape set that we are, is out oriented. It is into identity. And to be an I separate from everybody else means you forget the oceanic that you are. You now are lost in searching in the waves for something you always are. You've never been anything but. It is it is the most ordinary thing to have this enlightenment wake up in you because it's you are ordinarily the ocean. And so there then comes a very interesting twilight zone, a meeting where a master and the master who has remembered he is the ocean, will try to use language of the wave shape to create situations and to hint upon something that makes you, uh, some people, uh, realize that you can't find what you're seeking outside of yourself. You are the thing you're seeking. You have never been other than godliness. Not a God persona. That's one of the mistakes. People seek a God as a personality, an imaginary friend for adults. And and it is not that way. You are, have always been the divine. Even the devil is Dev, the divine. That is the hypothesis. It's not to be believed. It's not to be disbelieved. That's a trap. You have to go beyond the trap of believing or disbelieving. You have to actually, strangely enough, science, outer science and inner science of knowing the source are very similar. They follow the same scientific uh, art of witnessing. You have a hypothesis. Is everything I'm seeking outside, which I can never seem to find, is that because I somehow, unaware of it, am the thing I'm seeking? And uh, and all these forms that are constantly changing, living and dying, is one nature of a world of waves, movements in consciousness. But the ocean, but how do I then, how can I find something I already am? And then the process, that's the hypothesis. And then you see if it's so or not through the scientific method. And which I was very surprised many years ago when I realized that the scientific method is exactly the meditation method. So science has two wings. And in the Aquarian age, it will flourish greatly when the science of phenomenal search is balanced by subjective. Then science will fly. And it won't make things that destroy things. It will see the point that artificial idiocy is, that the living organic being must always be the master in any situation relationship with its machines. I mean, I love Data. I love that character, but Data only works because Data is played by a human being. Try to create a Data that is completely soulless, and it will act really well. It will do really well. It's like a lot of this artificial intelligence that are actually making, like somebody could make a facsimile of me as an artificial intelligence making these statements. But if you have an inner eye, you'll know it's fake, even if it, because really you could also say, as Buddha once said when he saw face to face in this final enlightened, he said, he called this kind of demonic thing that was there, the architect of ego. And he simply witnessed it and then disappeared.
Hmm.
So and became back into the whole. Now, when that's happened, you can enjoy, or you can be in this world of change. We are but visitors that have never been born and never died. It only appears that we live and die. But this is the godliness. And anyway, that is my experience. I can't it, experience, any words are not going, the fragments of words cannot embrace and tell you the whole. They can only hint.
All right. All right. Well, we're at that time, John. Let me remind you all.
But is rebuttal? Did we ever get to 10 Tigers' first rebuttal?
Well, I mean, we kind of covered it. We've been talking.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I appreciate everybody typing in their questions. We like an interactive audience when we do these shows, and we do these shows usually every 2 weeks. But to remind the audience, in the description of this video and all the videos I do with John, there's a link there that will take you to his website. Please click that link, go to the website, and sign up for his periodicals, and perhaps even sign up for a reading. So, John, briefly, if you can explain what those are for the audience, maybe they'll purchase.
Yes, my Hogue Prophecy Report is usually a bi-monthly. It's kind of a zine, a e-magazine, and it's fully illustrated. And I send it to you using your email address to send you a PDF file, an Adobe PDF file that you can transform into a very easily readable file on your phone or any other device. And basically we talk about a lot of things today we're talking about are some of the topics that I've just been writing about in my most recent Hogue Prophecy report, which will be released in a few days. And they're also fully illustrated. I also make them funny as much as I can. And for $60, if you go to my website, hogueprophecy.com, and look at the free samples, there are also links there so that if you like what you see and want to see more, you have three options. You can subscribe for a year, just $5 a year, $60 in one $60 payment. You can also become an automatic payer so that your monthly, whatever, $5 or whatever you want to give a month, uh, can $5 or more, that's the limit, can be you can be on it as long as you wish to be on and then get off it when you don't want to be there if you wish. And there's also, for some who just want to budget it where they will just look at the freebies and just get the full Hogue Prophecy report of that one report, they can do that for $5 or a little more. And then I send you just the full report that was just released. And then later, if you want to uh, do that again, you can do that too. So there's all kinds of options to get this. Now, also, if you go to the top of hogueprophecy.com, you will see an ad about my readings in red, Hogue readings. And these readings start with an astrological study of the Kelly Blue Book of your birth chart, the strengths, the weaknesses, the potentials in your birth chart. And then it goes deeper into what is an empathic reading, which also will include a multi-layered kind of unusual way of doing the Celtic cross with the Osho Zen tarot deck. And these readings can last for a couple hours. If a lot of times we just go as long as we need to go deep. So it's lots of fun. Time flies really fast during the reading. It's always a shock when you realize that maybe you've all listening and watching me today have also noticed how these 2.5 hours have blown just quickly by. And so yes, so I hope that is so you when you see the link, click on the email link. And all you need to do is put Hogue reading in your subject line. If you want to say more, that's fine. But because I have my setup wide open so that I don't let any machines tell me what I want censored or not. So I can there's a lot of emails that I have to look at. A lot of it's garbage, but if you make a simple subject line like that, I will see it and I'll immediately get back to you with the further instructions on how you can do this online reading on Zoom with me.
All right. Everybody, the link is in the description and also in the chat. So click that link. That'll take you to John's website. So John, thank you for a great and entertaining show. And I greatly appreciate everybody participating in the chat.
Thank you, everybody. God, I wish we did. Were there other questions?
We covered everybody's question that typed in.
Good,
But
good. I thank you all I love doing questions because it's so spontaneous.
right, right. Okay, well, John, tell the audience to goodbye and good night.
Goodbye and good night, audience.
All right. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and see you in a couple weeks. Bye bye.